Welcome to the philosophical bedrock of your BCBA exam prep. In this segment, we're diving into radical behaviorism, the core worldview that separates behavior analysis from every other psychology. Why does this matter? Because Domain A, Behaviorism and Philosophical Foundations, makes up 5% of your exam with 8 scored questions, and these foundational concepts underpin everything else you'll study. We'll start by defining radical behaviorism as the philosophical stance that rejects internal mental causes and instead focuses on observable behavior and environmental events. From there, we'll map the 4 branches of behavior analysis, then unpack the 7 dimensions of ABA from Baer et al., 1968, the gold standard for evaluating quality interventions. You'll also master key distinctions: behavior versus response class, and stimulus versus stimulus class. These aren't just definitions, they're the tools you'll use to analyze every scenario on exam day. Let's build that foundation. Radical behaviorism is the philosophical foundation of applied behavior analysis, and the BCBA exam will test your understanding of how it differs from other psychological approaches. At its core, radical behaviorism rejects mentalism, meaning it avoids explaining behavior by appealing to internal mental states like willpower or beliefs as causes. Instead, it focuses on environmental interactions. Crucially, it includes private events, thoughts, feelings, and sensations, as behavior itself, subject to the same principles as public actions. This is a key exam distinction. Private events are not dismissed but are analyzed as behavior shaped by contingencies. The worldview is deterministic. Behavior is lawful, caused by genetic and environmental variables, not free will. For the exam, remember that environmental contingencies of reinforcement and punishment shape all behavior, both public and private. Truth is judged pragmatically, by what works in prediction and control, not by correspondence to mental reality. Finally, radical behaviorism is rooted in selectionism. Behavior is selected by consequences across phylogeny, ontogeny, and culture, mirroring natural selection. This slide outlines the 4 branches of behavior analysis, a foundational framework for the BCBA exam. At the top is behaviorism, the philosophy asserting that behavior is a product of interactions with the environment, not internal mental states, a key distinction from cognitive explanations. Below it, the experimental analysis of behavior, EAB, represents basic laboratory research that discovers and refines principles like reinforcement, often using non-human subjects in controlled settings. Applied behavior analysis, ABA, then translates these principles into socially significant human behavior change in real-world settings such as clinics and schools. Finally, professional practice involves delivering these interventions to consumers, guided by behaviorism's philosophy and grounded in EAB and ABA research. For the exam, understand that each branch serves a distinct role. Philosophy provides the conceptual foundation, EAB generates the science, ABA tests application, and practice ensures ethical, effective delivery. Questions may ask you to identify which branch a specific activity belongs to, so recognize that basic lab studies fall under EAB, while classroom interventions are ABA. The 7 dimensions of ABA, established by Baer, Wolf, and Risley in 1968, are foundational to the field and essential for the BCBA exam. The applied dimension ensures we target socially significant behaviors, those that meaningfully improve a client's daily life and functioning, such as communication or self-care skills. The behavioral dimension requires a focus on observable and measurable behaviors, which can be reliably recorded and quantified, avoiding hypothetical constructs. The analytic dimension demands experimental control, demonstrating a functional relationship between the intervention and behavior change. Finally, the technological dimension mandates that procedures be described so clearly and concisely that others can implement them accurately and consistently. On the exam, you will need to identify which dimension is being demonstrated in a scenario, so remember that applied emphasizes social relevance, behavioral focuses on measurability, analytic requires experimental control, and technological highlights replicable procedures. Domain A on the BCBA exam covers behaviorism and philosophical foundations, and it's a compact but critical section. You'll face 8 scored questions here, making up just 5% of the total exam. While that may seem small, these questions test your grasp of radical behaviorism's core principles, like mentalism versus behaviorism, or the philosophical underpinnings of behavior analysis, which are foundational to every other domain. The full exam has 104 tasks across 9 domains, but remember, those tasks are distributed among 175 scored items, plus 10 unscored pilot questions, for a total of 185. So, out of those 175 questions that actually count toward your score, only 8 come from Domain A. That means you need to be efficient. Don't overstudy this domain at the expense of higher-weighted ones, but don't ignore it either. A strong conceptual understanding of radical behaviorism will help you reason through questions in later domains, especially when interpreting measurement, assessment, or intervention from a behavioral perspective. On this slide, we're breaking down 3 foundational terms you must master for the BCBA exam: behavior, response, and response class. Behavior is defined as any activity or movement of an organism, including private events like thinking or feeling, and the classic test is, if a dead man could do it, it's not behavior. A response is a single, specific instance of that behavior, defined by how you operationally measure it, so folding one shirt is a response. A response class, however, groups together topographically different responses that all produce the same consequence or serve the same function. For example, folding a shirt and folding pants are different responses, but both belong to the same response class if they complete the laundry task. Similarly, saying for and writing for are distinct responses that both answer 2 + 2 correctly. On the exam, you'll be asked to distinguish between these levels: behavior as a general class, response as a countable instance, and response class as functionally similar actions. Understanding this hierarchy is essential for identifying and measuring target behaviors in functional assessments and intervention plans. This slide clarifies a foundational distinction you must master for the BCBA exam. A single stimulus is any environmental change you can sense, like a loud bang or bright sunlight, while a stimulus class is a group of stimuli that share a common effect on behavior. Notice that physical/formal classes group stimuli by shared features, such as all red objects or all high-pitched sounds, whereas functional classes group stimuli that evoke or abate the same response, like different foods that all make you salivate. Temporal classes, critical for understanding consequences, group stimuli that occur in a consistent time relation to behavior, such as various reinforcers that follow the same operant. On the exam, you will be asked to identify whether a given example describes a single stimulus or a class, and to distinguish among physical, functional, and temporal classes. Mastering this comparison helps you analyze how environmental events control behavior, a core competency for designing effective behavior change programs. This slide breaks down a foundational distinction you must master for the BCBA exam: respondent versus operant conditioning. Respondent conditioning involves involuntary, reflexive behaviors, like salivation or an eye blink, elicited by antecedent stimuli through stimulus-stimulus pairing. Extinction here means presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. Operant conditioning, by contrast, involves voluntary behaviors that are emitted and shaped by their consequences. Reinforcement increases future probability, punishment decreases it, and extinction requires withholding the maintaining reinforcer. The key distinctions are critical for exam questions. Respondent behaviors are elicited by antecedents and involve the autonomic nervous system, while operant behaviors are emitted and controlled by the three-term contingency of SDBSR, involving skeletal muscles. Remember, both processes can occur simultaneously, for example, anxiety, respondent, paired with avoidance, operant. On the exam, you may be asked to identify which process is at work or how extinction differs between the two, so be ready to apply these distinctions to real-world scenarios. On this slide, we're breaking down positive versus negative reinforcement, two core concepts you must distinguish for the BCBA exam. Both increase the future likelihood of a behavior, but the key difference lies in what happens to the stimulus after the behavior. Positive reinforcement involves adding a desirable stimulus, like a child receiving a cookie after completing chores, which makes chore completion more likely. Negative reinforcement, by contrast, involves removing an aversive stimulus, for example, when John uses a no PC to reject a toy, and the teacher removes that toy, reinforcing appropriate rejection. Notice that both procedures strengthen behavior. The exam will test whether you can identify the operation based on stimulus change. A common trap is confusing negative reinforcement with punishment. Remember, reinforcement always increases behavior. Your exam tip: focus on whether a stimulus is added, positive, or removed, negative, after the behavior. Mastering this distinction will help you correctly analyze scenarios and avoid losing points on applied questions. This timeline traces the philosophical and scientific lineage that every BCBA candidate must internalize. It begins in 1913 with Watson's Behaviorist Manifesto, which established methodological behaviorism, a view that studied only publicly observable behavior while ignoring private events. Skinner's 1938 work then introduced operant conditioning, shifting the focus to how consequences shape behavior, which became the foundation for the experimental analysis of behavior. In 1968, Baer, Wolf, and Risley published the 7 Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis, giving the field its applied identity and ethical framework. Finally, in 1974, Skinner's About Behaviorism articulated radical behaviorism, which is critical for the exam because it distinguishes itself from earlier views by including private events like thoughts and feelings as behavior subject to the same principles. Understanding this evolution helps you recognize why radical behaviorism rejects mentalism and why the BACB's task list emphasizes observable, measurable behavior. This timeline is not just history, it explains the philosophical stance that underpins every intervention you will design. On this slide, we're breaking down 3 essential types of reinforcers you'll need to distinguish for the BCBA exam. An unconditioned reinforcer, like food or warmth, works without any learning history, it's biologically built in. A conditioned reinforcer, such as praise or tokens, starts neutral but gains reinforcing power through pairing with an existing reinforcer. Then we have generalized conditioned reinforcers, like money, which are paired with multiple different reinforcers, making them effective across many contexts. For the exam, the key distinction is learning history. Unconditioned requires none, conditioned requires pairing with one reinforcer, and generalized requires pairing with many. You'll often see scenario-based questions asking you to identify which type is at play. For example, if a child works for tokens that can be exchanged for snacks and toys, those tokens are generalized reinforcers. Understanding these categories helps you design effective reinforcement systems and predict behavior under different conditions. On this slide, we distinguish between automatic and socially mediated contingencies, a key distinction for the BCBA exam. Automatic contingencies occur when the behavior itself directly produces reinforcement or punishment, with no other person involved. For example, scratching an itch provides immediate sensory relief, or touching a hot stove yields automatic pain. Socially mediated contingencies, by contrast, involve another person delivering the consequence, such as a teacher giving a sticker for completed work or a parent scolding a child for swearing. This distinction is critical in functional assessment. Behaviors maintained by automatic reinforcement often show undifferentiated results in a standard functional analysis because the consequence is not controlled by the environment. In contrast, socially maintained behaviors produce clear differentiation when the social consequence is manipulated. For the exam, you must be able to identify whether a behavior's maintaining consequence is automatic or socially mediated, as this directly guides intervention. Automatic contingencies often require sensory-based interventions, while socially mediated ones call for adjusting social consequences. On this slide, we distinguish between rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior, a key distinction for the BCBA exam. Rule-governed behavior is controlled by verbal descriptions of contingencies, meaning a person follows instructions or rules without direct experience. For example, baking a cake by following a recipe relies on verbal rules, not prior baking experience. Contingency-shaped behavior, in contrast, develops through direct exposure to reinforcement and punishment, like learning to ride a bike through trial and error, where staying upright is reinforced naturally. Rules offer advantages. They allow rapid learning and help avoid dangerous or delayed consequences. On the exam, remember the core distinction: rule-governed behavior is controlled by verbal descriptions, while contingency-shaped behavior is shaped by direct contact with contingencies. You may be asked to identify which type is at play in a scenario or to explain why a rule might be necessary, for instance, when direct experience would be harmful or impractical. Understanding this difference is essential for designing effective interventions. As we close, remember that radical behaviorism is your philosophical anchor. It rejects mentalistic explanations and focuses on observable behavior influenced by environment. You've explored the 4 branches, the 7 dimensions of ABA, and key distinctions like behavior versus response class, stimulus versus stimulus class, and respondent versus operant conditioning. Mastery of positive and negative reinforcement, along with unconditioned, conditioned, and generalized reinforcers, is essential for Domain A. The evolution of behavior analysis shows how our science grew from early foundations to today's ethical practice. Understanding automatic versus socially mediated contingencies and rule-governed versus contingency-shaped behavior sharpens your ability to analyze real-world cases. On the exam, these concepts appear in scenario-based questions, so connect each term to its function. You've built a strong conceptual toolkit. Now, take that clarity into every study session. Own these principles, because they are the bedrock of everything you'll do as a BCBA. Stay focused, stay curious, and keep pushing. You are building the expertise to change lives.